Welcome, friends. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Nina Simons, co-founder and chief relationship officer at Bioneers, who leads their Everywoman's leadership program. Throughout her career, Nina has worked with nearly 1,000 diverse women leaders across disciplines, race, class, age, and orientation to create conditions for mutual learning, trust, and leadership development. Today, we'll talk about her book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred: A Woman Listens for Leadership. The second edition came out in June 2022 with an accompanying discussion guide and embodied practices. You can find a link to it and other resources we mention in the conversation in the show notes. If you enjoy this episode, please share it and subscribe. To learn more about Buddhism through my free courses or my book for beginners, The Buddhist Path to Joy, please see the episode notes. May you and all beings be well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am so curious to talk to you about you, your work, the Bioneers, and your beautiful book. But I'm wondering if you could just start us out with a little bit of your story and how you got to the place where you were really working in this very interdisciplinary, just deeply spiritually informed practice.
Well, I'll give it a try, Claire. Let's see. I want to find my way into this story. I think my life path has been informed by having parents who are both artists and growing up without any spiritual practice. And what I found early in my life was that nature was my source of solace, that when I was facing hardship or unhappy or confused, I turned to nature, and nature became my way of finding my own center again. And then I had the gift of studying with a spiritual school that was actually a school for conscious evolution called Eureka in my 20s. And that introduced me to all kinds of practices, some from Buddhism, some from, visualization and meditation and group practices and all kinds of things. And I think that in a way, perhaps because I had not grown up with any religious training and my orientation was to sort for myself and find what practices and what traditions carried the most meaning. I was informed by that. And this through line that happened through my life of realizing that nature was my deepest devotion. I think early on, when I realized how much I love Mother Life, I call her, I thought, if I speak about this in public, people are going to think I'm crazy. And then I had my first real sense of calling when I visited a biodiversity garden in southern New Mexico. That was unbelievably beautiful. And I had grown up in New York City. I didn't have any background in farming or gardening. I had the most sensually ecstatic experience in that garden while I was being introduced to each plant by the master gardener who was cultivating all this amazing diversity right up next to each other. And his name was Gabriel Howarth, and he would introduce us to each plant using the common name and the Latin name. And then he would explain to us how it was related to all the plants around it. And the colors and the smells and the tastes were just stunningly beautiful. And I thought maybe this is what the Garden of Eden was actually based upon, was this level of exquisite beauty. And And then he told us about how the biodiversity of seeds was being threatened by corporate agriculture and by mom and pop companies being gobbled up by major corporations. And by the time I walked out of that garden, I felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're working for me now." And I was utterly shocked, Claire. I had no background or training in it. And it was not at all what I ever imagined I would do. And the man who became my husband and partner, Kenny Ossadell, then went on to co-found a company called Seeds of Change with that master gardener and another. And I served the biodiversity of all life for several years as we grew that company. And I had never felt so fulfilled in a work situation in my life prior to that, because it was such a sacred service. And, I would stay up all nights writing seed catalogs with the master gardener and just loved it. And then Kenny was doing a lot of research about biodiversity and bioremediation. And he was discovering that there were amazing innovators who were learning how to work with nature to heal nature, as well as indigenous and native peoples for whom a right relationship with the natural world was a part of their worldview and their culture. And so one day he was regretting to a friend that all these amazing people, he was discovering that no one had ever heard of them. And the friend said, "Why don't you have a conference?" And Kenny said, "I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that?" And the friend gave him a grant and said, "Here's $10,000, go have a conference." And Kenny came to me because I had a background in theater and I had never been to a conference either. And so together we began Seeds of Change. We began the Bioneers in 1990. And Bioneers is many things. It's an organization that has become really a media company that creates podcasts and lots of videos and newsletters and all kinds of stuff, that's much of which is generated through an annual convening. And Bioneers is unusual in that it integrates leadership from all walks of life and really looks at human civilization as a subset of the natural world and has indigeneity at its heart. So in many ways, my worldview and my learning has been deeply informed by an indigenous worldview. And then I had a big awakening about how my gender was affecting my lived experience. And so in the time since the mid-90s, I have had some increased focus on both gender equity and racial equity, which is a lot of what I write about in the book. And basically saw a film called The Burning Times, which really kicked off my learning in a major way and helped me understand that all the problems that I had learned about from Bioneers could be seen as an imbalance of the feminine and the masculine, not only in each of us as individuals, but in our social systems and our entire civilization at large. And so I started investigating gender and leadership and women's leadership in particular. And so a spiritual worldview has always run through my experience, my learning, and my teaching and my work. And as I was mentioning earlier, I've had a number of really remarkable Buddhist teachers, as well as indigenous teachers, for whom I am so, so grateful. So that's the romp through my life. That's the quickest I can sort of summarize it. I hope that helped.
Thank you for sharing. I feel like often, knowing how someone got to the place where they are helps to understand, why these issues feel so personal. There's so many wonderful things about your work, about the Bioneers. I just want to, I'd like to ask you to define a couple of terms. The first one is leadership. You've used that term a couple of times. And I think you mentioned this in, I believe, the introduction to your own book. And I think it's true for me too. Like when I was first introduced to the idea of leadership, I thought of like people who wanted to run for office or be CEOs or something. And I thought, oh, that's not me. In fact, it's kind of gross. So what do you mean by leadership?
Well, just as you're describing, Claire, when I first was named for my leadership, I wanted to deflect it any way I could. I didn't like it. I didn't think I'd earned it. I thought it painted a target on my back. And it really set me off on an inquiry, because what I realized was that I had learned through Bioneers that the earth is asking for us all to be leaders right now, each in our own unique way. And that we have inherited definitions of leadership that are outmoded and are getting in our way. And so my first book was called Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart. And it has several men in it as well. Because I read a zillion transcripts of leaders I had heard through Bioneers to try to understand who are the people who inspire me most and why, and how is their leadership different than our conventional models. And I think exactly as you said, you know, in the, we, and as Buddhism teaches so beautifully, we all have inherited biases and mental models. And clearly, the more conscious we can become about them, the better. So for me, leadership was one of those biases. And I realized that in the conventional model, leadership is conferred externally, right? It's often people who have graduate degrees or have inherited wealth, or they're particularly tall and charismatic, you know, and aggressive, right? All these things that I never wanted to be. And what I found by studying the ones that I most admired was that their leadership all came from their own love and devotion to some aspect of life. It was not externally conferred, but came from inside themselves and from their love and devotion. They also were people who shared authority rather than holding authority tightly. They were people who were not afraid to say, I don't know, and to look to others for guidance, right? So there were, and to enlist the help of others. And what I've also found over time is that there are all kinds of categories of leadership that don't fit into the conventional model. And yet, in my experience, parenting, for example, is one of the most demanding and important and essential forms of leadership anyone can do. And yet, in our capitalist culture, it tends to not be honored as such. You know, similarly, artists and caregivers are incredible forms of leadership. And, you know, what I learned was that it's possible to lead not only from the front of the room, but from the back of the room, from the middle of the room. There are ways to influence others that are subtle and very different than our mental models might dictate. And so I think leadership is something we're all redefining every day. And in many ways, I see it as the flourishing of what our souls brought us here to bring to this moment in Earth's evolution.
I guess a follow-on question for that is, why is it important now for each of us to recognize that potential for leadership within ourselves?
Well, as I imagine everyone listening is aware, we are living through a confluence of crises. And there are crises in almost every area of our lives that involve the culmination and the breaking apart of old structures that are no longer serving. So I often think of it as the confluence of patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and racism. You know, if we look at those, we can get a pretty good sense of what we're living through right now, combined, of course, with climate change and the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, my sense is that every area of our lives is asking us to bring what we're here to bring. And much of our conditioning is telling us to stay small and not make waves and be quiet. And actually, I think this is a time when the truest expression of our heart's devotion is needed in some form of activist expression. And so I think, you know, I think we're looking at a time where the future of life on Earth is threatened. And that's a time that calls us each to be courageous and brave in bringing what we're here to bring, and not comparing ourselves or our leadership or our calling to anyone else's, because I believe there are as many forms of leadership and of calling as we are individuals on the planet at this time.
The way you describe it, leadership almost sounds like a spiritual practice or exercise, you know, exercising right power with instead of power over, or renouncing our own power and letting someone else fill that space with who knows what.
Absolutely. And for some of us, it may be expressing the visions that come to us in meditations or in dream time, or that our bodies, you know, bring to us as intuition. Because I think we are all in a process of hospicing the old civilization and bringing into form a new civilization. And it's a challenging time to live through, but also an incredibly exciting one. And especially for those of us who are consciously guiding where we give our attention. It's very exciting to be part of the world that's being born, and very energizing and invigorating. And for me, it is a spiritual practice, absolutely.
You know, speaking of sort of providing hospice care for this old structure of the world that's breaking apart right now, you know, it feels to me, listening to this definition of leadership, or, you know, reading what you've written in your most recent, the most recent edition of your book, it really feels to me like we are watching the disintegration of something old. But in Tibetan teachings, that disintegration, it opens up a period of tremendous possibility where the new is being shaped in ways that are going to be, you know, it lays the foundation for what comes next. And it makes me think of collective karma, the idea that there's not just what I do individually, but there's what I'm contributing to the whole. And we're in such a moment of collective, you know, breakdown in preparation, you know, for whatever comes next. Like, intentions are incredibly important in the teachings on the death and rebirth process. So any of us, you know, cultivating those intentions, holding it in the way that we interact with each other, that we show up in the world, you know, I think it's easy to hear the word activism and to think it needs to be like a big thing. But, you know, the way that you're describing leadership, it sounds to me like this is something that maybe even we should start with ourselves first and then look for the organic ways to offer it out to the world.
I think that's totally accurate, Claire, and that any work that we want to offer that we haven't done within ourselves first is sort of, I don't know, it's perpetuating a paradigm of teaching that doesn't feel authentic or integrated. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think that it is a deeply personal practice, and I think we have to be careful of the bias. I call it the bias toward bigness, because for many of us, this may be a very personal, quiet practice, and it may emanate out through our interactions with our families and friends and the people at the checkout counter and, the people we interact with in our daily lives. And that's leadership too. So I think part of the old definition of leadership is that bias toward bigness. And I think right now that the reinvention that we're all a part of actually involves investing our time, attention, and efforts locally first, and exceedingly locally within our own bodies and psyches and selves.
Yeah, definitely. I know within the Buddhist traditions, there's so much emphasis on intention, on motivation. And I think it's easy to think we know what the answer is, but if it's not actually, grounded in the wisdom of understanding the situation and the compassion of, starting with ourselves and not thinking, I think it was on a Brene Brown episode of her podcast, Unlocking Us, recently. She was talking about the importance of not creating the distance between ourselves and others that thinks I have the solution. That's more like pity than compassion. And so for me, it's very powerful, to hear that this starts at home, and that I don't necessarily have to start by, making a big action, making a big statement. Often those end up coming off as inauthentic anyway, or being unhelpful.
Absolutely. And I actually think that it's really part of the definition of leadership that we're all co-creating, that we can't know all the answers, that we have to cultivate a relationship with mystery, right? And with humility. And I think that propensity to imagine we know answers may be a relic of a combination of patriarchy and white supremacy. And neither of those systems are helpful in this case. In fact, they're the systems we're all working to heal from. So I think humility is far greater value in this practice than imagining we know the answers. Yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to point out the subtitle of your book, A Woman Listens for Leadership. Very different from that kind of top down, I'm going to tell you because I'm the leader.
Yes. Well, I've been fortunate enough to know and get to teach with Deborah Eden Tull for many years. And so she has been a wonderful mutual mentor for me. And my own practice of deep listening has, of course, deepened because of knowing her, as has my capacity to witness and value and respect darkness and not knowing. Yeah. Really good.
Can you say a little bit more about? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about the value of that darkness, the not knowing? I think that's really hard for us, in Western societies to wrap our heads around, and especially in the context of leadership.
Well, I think that it is deeply related to the yin within ourselves and to being able to rest in a place of true receptivity. One of the essays in my book, which we mentioned before starting this recording, was about a ceremony that I did called Winter Dreaming, that involved lying on my back in a darkened room, fully darkened room, with a bunch of other people for hours, and just receiving And I don't even want to say just practicing receiving. And what I found was that, darkness has many more textures and nuances, and our bodies have more ways of listening and receiving than we typically tend to practice in Western civilization. And so the bias towards light and action and doing and knowing, I believe, needs the balance of our respect and reverence for the mystery of not knowing and of cultivating our capacity to sit in true wonder and receptivity on as many levels as we can cultivate in ourselves to receive guidance from the invisible world. And some may see that as the guidance comes from nature. Sometimes it seems to come from ancestors or dreams. Sometimes you don't know where it came from. You just know that it came up in a meditation. And so I believe that the calling that is the most profound to me right now is to listen as deeply with as many parts of myself as I know how, because I believe that we are all surrounded by elders and wisdom, if only we can quiet and still ourselves enough to receive it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I definitely agree with that. And maybe this is a good segue moment into another term I'd like to ask you to define. It's also really important to this book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, and to your work in the Bioneers, which is indigeneity. Could you explain what that is and how it's important?
Sure. When we first began Bioneers, we always had Indigenous elders as part of the voices and vision informing it. And we were very fortunate in that way. And I think what we recognized was that really, while there are a great many differences among us, we're all indigenous to Mother Earth. And if you go back far enough, we all have indigenous ancestors. And so, it is a delicate dance at this time when people of indigenous lineage are going through so many permutations around identity and reclaiming culture and language and tradition. But in some very core spiritual sense, indigeneity really refers to the notion that we're all indigenous to this planet and to Mother Life. And so it's kind of a both and, where I seek to practice tremendous respect and humility for all that I don't know about indigenous cultures and peoples, while showing up as a white ally in every way that I know how. And at the same time, holding true to the spiritual principle that my ancestors are indigenous too.
Yeah, I think it actually just now hit me that that is so historically weird for humans not to think of themselves as indigenous to the place where they are. Like the whole circumstances, I don't even know. Do we trace it back to the European Enlightenment? And, I want to ask you about the burning times in just a moment, but just the idea that Western culture feels like it became unmoored from being indigenous and then kind of, colonized much of the world. How strange is that? No wonder we're kind of messed up.
It's true. I sometimes think of those of us who feel that way as being like plants that have had our root systems severed, you know? And the more that I look into my ancient lineage, the more I understand that my ancestors have lived on practically every continent on Earth. And so it's a very odd thing. And the truth is that I believe that indigenous peoples who have not been severed from their ancestral root landscape carry wisdom that is deeply, deeply needed for all of our survival in this time. Mm-hmm. And so the burning times, let's see if I can offer this as a quick story. I was in a moment of my life where I was in deep mourning. My father had recently died, and I was feeling very broken open. And a friend recommended this film to me, and I took it home and watched it. And it's called The Burning Times. It's available online. You can watch it for free. It was made in the early 90s. It's about an hour-long film that's somewhat dated, but it tells the story of the 300 to 400 year period in European history where somewhere between 50,000 and several million people, principally women, were systematically hunted and persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And when I first saw it, I had many reactions. I was shocked that I had not learned about this in school, because I had learned about the Salem witch trials, which is a tiny, tiny fractal of what happened all over Europe. And it set me on a path of inquiry where I researched all about the burning times, because I wanted to understand how much of that film was based in historical fact. And what I found clear was that when I saw the film, and I immediately watched it sort of 2 or 3 times, there were several things that I had witnessed within myself that began to make sense to me that had never made sense to me before. And one of them was a fear that I had of speaking my truth in public. And another was, just the sense that by dint of being born into a female gendered body, I was in some way inferior or in danger. And the more that I reflected upon that, the more that I found that I believe that the legacy of that time lives on in my bones. And in fact, it was not only in the European nations that this happened, but there were sort of correlative things that happened in other countries and continents around the world. And so what's been fascinating to me has been, first, my research helping me understand that during the course of the burning times, 7 generations of children witnessed their mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers systematically tortured and burned, right? Which is kind of hard to imagine, but 7 generations. And that all of the civilizational systems shifted during that time. So, for example, before the burning times, women owned more wealth in Europe than the men. And there was a huge transfer of wealth that happened during the burning times. And there was a shift in relationship to land, because at the beginning of the burning times, people lived in communities and were held in a commons where they shared land use. And by the end of the burning times, something had happened called the enclosure movement. And suddenly land was privatized and fenced in, and there was no more commons. And medicine and the practice of healing transitioned during the burning times. At the beginning, of course, the women were the herbalists and the midwives and the death doulas. And those were the women who were the first to be persecuted for being witches. And by the end of the burning times, in order to practice medicine, you had to have gone to a medical school, and only men were permitted to attend medical school. So there was, all these social systems shifted from the purview of women to the purview of men. And in the spiritual realm, of course, this was the time of the rise of Catholicism. And it was a tremendous shift from people having their own direct, embodied, immanent experience of the divine to having an intermediated experience of the sacred. So I was just, it shifted my path dramatically to learn all of this. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, the discovery of science that there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma that gets carried, right, through multiple generations causes me to believe
epigenetics. It turns out some of those changes are transmissible. I mean, who knew?
Yes, exactly. And so it kind of lends some credence and helps me understand why a system of patriarchy is so intractable. And, there are researchers who believe that the gender bias is the deepest bias in the human psyche, deeper than faith or race or anything else. And, it's been around a long time.
It has. I think we're kind of at a moment now where people are beginning to have the freedom to question, these very social constructs around gender. And you can just see how much it freaks people out. I'm from Texas where people lost their minds about trans bathroom stuff. I mean, there were actual problems to worry about, and that's what people freaked out about. Yeah. So it's just, I think when you point to how entrenched that is, it does feel like that's just one really big piece of these big systems kind of coming up from the unconscious depths and finally getting a little light on them, and maybe they don't really hold up that well.
Well, exactly. And, thankfully, many younger people are escaping the binary altogether. And isn't it a time for us to embrace nuance and see where we can dance with apparent contradictions? And and even, the scarcity mentality that underpins a capitalist culture is incredibly damaging, I think, to our collective dreaming a new world into being.
Yeah, 100%. Just to go back to, the story of these times of terrible persecution of women, what approximate date range are we talking there?
We're talking approximately between 1300 and 1700 or 1400 and 1750, somewhere in there. Yeah.
So basically the beginning of modern Europe.
Well, it is. And it's also a period that's often referred to as the Enlightenment.
Right.
Ironically. So, we live in a multivalent world that is light and dark and everything in between all the time. And there it is. But this is part of the hidden history of that time, just as we are in a process of unearthing hidden histories of, this country and what it was founded upon and all of the genocidal, horrifying history that has not been taught to most of our citizens. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And, as painful as it is, for some of these underlying realities to kind of come to light, from a Buddhist perspective, we're trapped in these things until we can see them. Yes. So the fact that it's all beginning to come to light right now, I know a lot of folks would rather just push it back down, but it does feel like a tremendous opportunity to realize how our mental world was put together, not just the physical culture we live in, but like our map of what is real, what matters, what's important, just for me, like it's like peeling away layers of an onion, which is a very common metaphor for mindfulness practice or deeper Vipassana practice, seeing into that collectively created sense of identity, I feel is just, at the root of what it means to wake up right now. Let's not have another enlightenment. Let's have an awakening. Those are, often people talk about the Buddha attaining enlightenment. That's not what the word is in Sanskrit or Tibetan. The Sanskrit word is bodhi. It means to wake up. And certainly you could call the European enlightenment a waking up of certain capacities, but at the cost of the other side of the human soul, it feels like.
Well, it does. And, I can offer a resource for folks who might not have heard about it. Coming from my own bias, of course, but my husband is many things, but he is also a filmmaker. And he recently completed a 10-part series that's called The Changing of the Gods. And it's a fascinating exploration of a combination of the history of social movements and the movement of the planets and how they may correlate. And it challenges a worldview that is so endemic to Western culture. How can these things be related? Well, after seeing all 10 episodes, you might ask, how could they not? It's pretty fascinating.
Oh, that is so cool. And I'll get the link for that so people can find it in the show notes and watch that, because it sounds really, really interesting as just understanding the background of where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's a good transition to asking a little bit more. We're finally getting around to actually focusing on your book here. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about indigeneity. I just want to underscore again for everyone listening and thinking, why is a book on leadership? Why would that be a spiritual act to read it? It's just trust me, it's completely backlit by, deep, receptive, non-dual, intuitive forms of wisdom. Also, it has exercises for reflection, for journaling, if that's what you like to do. If you have a meditation practice, these are great meditation prompts too. So you can actually not just read the book, but really take it in. So yeah, I'd like to just, maybe open up the floor to you. What is in this book? How can it help us maybe create a more hopeful future for ourselves?
Well, I think that if I were to try to summarize some of my learning, which comes from so many different sources, Claire, as you've identified, from Indigenous mentors and from Buddhist and other practitioners, and from a lot of women who have been amazing mentors. What I've found is that, and I think this is really congruent with all Buddhist practice, that we have tended to ignore or sublimate or hide parts of ourselves. And I think that we've done that at a great cost to our humanity and to our souls and to our spirituality and our leadership. And so in many ways, really, I think the book is a deep honoring of diversity in all its forms, both inner diversity, that we're all, I don't know about you, but I have a council that lives inside me, and there's a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old, and there are all these different ages, but there are also animals. There are people of different cultures, and I sometimes practice having a council session where I can bring some of them together and ask the question
Great.
that's most up for me and listen for what they have to say, right? So we all have different characters and creatures within us. And I think that what we're seeing right now is a time where our diversity is beginning to be valued, but we also have a lot of habituated learning that tells us to stay separate. And I think in the context of my most heartfelt spiritual yearning, it would be for us to experience ourselves in an embodied way as related to not only each other in all our diversity, but to all forms of life, and to the star people, and to the mountains and the rivers and the earth and the mycelium that live under the earth, you know? There's a marvelous short YouTube video that I would commend to everyone listening, and it's called "The Mycelium is Listening." And it's got Paul Stamets's voice narrating a kind of slightly psychedelic kind of journey. But what it's describing is that scientists have figured out that the mycelium under the earth respond to sound. And the sound that they most respond to are low frequencies like the sound of drumming.
Oh,
so
wow,
imagine,
that's cool.
Right? So all of our ancestors who knew to drum in a seasonal way and have ceremonies to call in the rain or the season changes, the mycelium are actually listening, right? And scientists are proving now that plants can see. They don't have eyes, but they can tell if you're wearing red or blue, you know? And so we are living in an intelligent cosmos. And so my book is really about how do we strengthen ourselves inwardly to accept all of our own parts so that we can learn to relate in a reverent way to all of the parts of the web of life that are our kin. Because the earth really needs us now. And that's my deepest heart yearning.
I feel like you're speaking directly to my soul, you know, the idea of just not just relating to each other, but relating to the mountain people and the star people. You know, I think a lot of people may not realize that Tibetan Buddhism is profoundly shamanic. It grew up in a culture where, you know, the mountains have their spirits, their deities or gods that are associated with them, and the whole world was alive. And you know, it's just a sense of everything being worthy of our respect, being alive and not appreciating when we abuse it, but also being capable of having these like sentient relationships with us. And I think the more I deepen my practice, first of all, the more I appreciate those shamanic elements in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but also the more it just feels like, how did we get here as a society that we can walk around this earth and not think we're part of a web? You know, the whole concept of, I was reading a book, I think it's called Nomads, which is about nomads. And, you know, it talked about the idea of really humans having power over the earth. I mean, it's situated in that European period, you know, the later part of it, the 1700s, where humans were just making this really unusual shift from being part of that web to thinking we were outside of it and can control it. And I think we can officially say on planet Earth right now, we have disproven that hypothesis definitively. We can't control global warming. I mean, it's, you know, we've created causes and now we're reaping the effects, and we don't have some button that we can push and undo those.
No, exactly. And really what's called for is nothing less than a shift in our worldview. on a
Yes.
mass scale to be able to affect the changes that are needed to sustain life on Earth.
Yes.
So the stakes are big. And it's a very joyful endeavor, you know?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I also just want to, acknowledge anytime you're called on or forced to make such a big change in the world you think you're living in, it can be incredibly, destabilizing, scary, etc. But I think books like this on nature, culture, and the sacred, they really call us to remember that joy that you're talking about, to not just focus on what we're losing, but to actually dream something so much bigger that we can't really, easily dream right now because of the ways we've been sort of indoctrinated into capitalism, white supremacy, all these things that make the world small and contained. Yeah, I think I'm just like rambling on right now, but I appreciate the work that you're doing to kind of help us all feel the frightened feelings, but then go on and experience that joyful newness too.
Well, and I think, for me, Claire, it has been all about serving what I most love. And I think when we serve what we love, it becomes regenerative and we get revitalized in the course of it. And it is an exacting practice at this time, as you say, to keep pulling our attention away from the mainstream media and the 3D world and to invest in our heart's desires and simultaneously shift from our mental models, peel away the onion skin, as you said, which frankly, I hope I do till the day I die because it seems endless. But also to just keep investing in leading from the heart and not from the mind. Because that's where nature wants us to lead from. And also to reawaken the immense capacities of our bodies. Because I think we have overinvested in our minds to the detriment of our body's wisdom. And that's part of what I call for in the book. So, here's to reclaiming all of ourselves and bringing all of ourselves with our grief and our joy to serving the future we really want to co-create, because we have an extraordinary opportunity to do so. And it's going to take time and probably some sacrifice, but that's okay. Anything really worthwhile probably does. So it's really good to be with you, Claire. And thank you for appreciating and sensing into the intent behind my book so beautifully and articulating it so well. I hope you write a review for me on Amazon. I need it.
Oh, yes. I should definitely do that. Yes.
Please,
thank you.
That would be a gift.
Yeah, well, I hope it'll help other people find and appreciate, what's so beautiful and just like life-giving about this book. And I'm wondering if you would maybe be willing to take us out with a note of hope, perhaps something to read, share with us from your work.
Sure. Well, I'm going to read a prayer that's in the book. So, may we have the humility to listen for guidance from the land, from our ancestors, and from our bodies and hearts, minds, and intuition. May we then have the wisdom to hear it and act upon it, even if it comes from the least expected places. May we face this fractured young nation's history, built upon genocide and slavery, lies, broken promises, and domination, and choose, for the sake of healing, to walk through the fear and traumas, the tears and fires needed for healing together. May we find the collective vision, courage, and will to decolonize our minds and hearts, reclaiming a balance of feminine and masculine, of tradition and vision, relationship and action in equal measure that will flow through each of us to all. Amen, Awomen, and Aho.
Alalahu. Thank you so much for joining us. I can't recommend strongly enough Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. If you're looking for something that'll help you feel less despondent and a little bit more hopeful and joyful, it's a wonderful book for that.
And come visit us at Bioneers.org, because it's a great resource for also lifting your spirits and reminding us all of the future that's within our grasp today.
Thanks for listening. May you and all beings be well.